Okay, well, before we technically get started, let's go back to what Julian was asking before, because everyone probably has the same question. Um, for the Palolo project, you should all have been sent a email that has everyone else that's working on your theme or your part of the project. I was trying to set that thing up in Canvas groups, but that obviously tanked. I've got to go rethink how that works. So for now, let's just do it old style. Email each other, or just what I would suggest is just if you already have an idea of what section or what area you want to work on, what aspect of it, email everyone else in your group and then, see what happens. My view is if the first person has some idea what they want wins by virtue of being first off the bat. Um, I was hoping it would happen earlier, but I haven't had anyone email. In fact, wait, no, I had 2 people email me yesterday afternoon that what they wanted to do. If I don't hear anything by Monday morning, I'm just gonna designate what aspects of the project people work on. So if you don't particularly care, then you don't have to say anything, I guess. If you do have some aspect, some part of what that theme that you really wanted to do, versus me telling you what you're going to do, then by all means, throw your 2 cents in and see. Some of the areas that should be pretty straightforward. Julian's is a little bit tricky because it's real easy if I think we've got 4 or 5 people looking at, no, I think there's 3 people looking at geology, 2 people looking at soils geomorphology. So, it's really easy for people to stumble over each other and discover the same thing 3 times, which won't do any of us any good. If there's an area where it looks like people can sort of accidentally sort of pile in and do the same thing, then I'm just going to basically tell people what aspect they want to look at if they don't say anything. Just as a note, I have sent out the proposal to the Palolo Neighborhood Board, since they're involved in a lot of issues in Palolo, not the least of which is that whole Alawai watershed thing, which you might have heard from Gail about. And also they're involved in that whole sort of landslip and lawsuits in the Waimau Road. So actually one of the board members already sent me back a contact for a guy that's actually done a soil study on the house and the areas that the houses are slipping and that they're accusing the city and county of screwing up with over on the Waimau side of Palolo. So I'm hoping they'll be a major resource for a lot of areas. But it'll depend, you just never know. Neighborhood boards are weird animals. I've worked with them before, and in some cases they'll be real supportive. Palolo's apparently frequently is. In other cases, they might, someone might get all hoo-hoo because, we're looking at Palolo or something like that. I don't know. I mean, that's true. If you deal with a Waialaika board, those folks are strange. So hopefully this will actually help us get some access to resources. We also have 4 people in the Palolo community that volunteered already, just hearing about this from my website, that want to get involved. So I'm gonna send them the same information and see what information they've got. So you guys are basically doing the archival part of stuff that's in print or on the web. We're also going to be trying to get, people's personal input in some of this. Not so much the geology. Geology is a pretty specialized area, but for a lot of these other areas, for example, what makes a Palolo community, it's going to be real interesting to see if people in Palolo can give us some input on what they think the communities are versus what we think we see by virtue of, say, the look of the houses, front yards, relative value of house, that type of thing, sort of what you might call the statistical or numerical. Sort of, if you would, the quantitative versus them giving us hopefully the qualitative. So depending on what area you're working in, you might be pretty much just doing your own thing with no input. In other areas, hopefully, might end up with some interesting input from the community on the same subject matter that would complement what you guys are doing. St. Louis School was planning to get involved this semester. I don't think it's happening. They're having so much. They're trying to be so careful bringing the kids back into school that everything else is just falling on the back burner. So I don't think St. Louis School is going to get involved in the spring. Sacred Hearts might get involved. We're in long sort of stutter discussions or Miracle Candaces in terms of them getting involved in the project. We haven't talked to the principal at the elementary school. He was actually interested in the project, but we haven't contacted him since early summer, and he's been super busy. So there's a chance there's going to be a whole mess of people sort of piling in on areas, and that's where your material becomes important, because what you guys are doing this semester is going to be stuff that is then done that we can then disseminate to everyone else, and then we build on that. So every semester we want to do a stacking process. You guys are basically laying a lot of the foundation work. None of the stuff you're going to do is going to get done in the sense it's going to be completed. What we expect from you guys by the end of the semester to get a good grade for the service learning part of this course is to give us the material that you've compiled. If you have any thoughts or analysis, then those are incredibly valuable. But what we mainly need to know is everything that you looked at. So you should, for example, have a work log. What you looked at, because you have to remember, and this is very true of any sort of research, what you don't find or what doesn't work is oftentimes a lot more important than what does work. Oftentimes, I think, especially because of TV and all the other crap like that, there's this idea that, if you're successful, if you do something right, then you score points. But the reality is, it's certainly true of my background as an archaeologist, where you don't find things is probably a lot more important than what you do find. Because what you don't find, if you thought you were going to find something there, then it challenges your assumptions. And Palolo's already been challenging our assumptions in a bunch of ways. So it's going to be interesting to see how this all sort of plays out. As I start to collect information, since I'm going to be working on the Land Court Awards, and I've also got to recompile the rest of the archaeology, oral history stuff that I've got, I'll write that up and then send it out to everyone. So I'll try to keep you abreast of what I'm working on too. So that's sort of where the project is right now. If it seems like it's always in limbo and we don't know from what day what we're doing the next, welcome to research. This is a classic example of what happens in a research project. They're all kapakahi 90% of the time, but as long as you have a goal in mind, you just sort of keep on working towards it. So don't worry if it seems sort of unstructured. Just make sure you find an area that you can actually sort of turf out or work on that you feel comfortable with. If you get that done, then expand the boundaries in another direction. But this is where I want you to make sure what your compatriots are doing in the same area, so you don't end up stumbling on top of each other. But as long as we don't do that, then we're doing research. And this is what you guys will be doing for the rest of your careers, no matter what field you go into, if you're going to make any money. So see this as a pre-job training internship, or something like that. Anyways, okay. This is a set of images way back when you guys were young and probably in grade school. We did a project with the state archives. I'm real good friends with the lady who was head of state archives till a couple of years ago. In fact, the state archival system. And what we were doing is digitizing the photos they have in the state archives. If you go to the state website and you go to Department of Accounting and General Services, you'll actually find the archives has put a huge amount of their photos on up, and they're publicly accessible. That's a lot of that scanning work was the work that you guys did, that your compatriots did back in the day as student volunteers at the archives. There were some of the volumes that we were not allowed to publicly post because they were actual picture volumes, like in a bound volume that had been donated to the archives, but with provisos that they never be made public. So we're sort of skipping on the edge of that, but I've checked, and legally we're not in totally bad shape. Hang on, just gotta check something here. Simply because this isn't public in the sense that I don't put this, for example, on YouTube. What's strange? Someone was asking me something in the chat, just disappeared. What the hell? Someone I think sent me a chat, but it vanished. Oh.
Hey, Professor, Thera Joy Romero. She said she's waiting and to be let in. She just messaged me.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. How come it's not? Yeah, this is really weird. Zoom's acting up. It's not telling me when people are trying to get in. Yeah, about half the class is waiting patiently outside, wondering what the hell happened. Thanks for letting me know. If you guys see anything else, then let me know, because like I say, it's acting up for some reason right now.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so what we've got is, this is one of these volumes that you're not allowed to see. You can actually, one of the ironies, of course, you can go to the state archives and you can see it. Oh, now your chat showed up. Who knows? Okay, so this is one of the volumes. It's one of Montserrat's volumes. Montserrat was one of the, I'm not sure what he originally was supposed to be, but he did a lot of maps here in the late 19th century. So I think he worked for the government in one shape or form. He collected photo albums, but they weren't his albums. And I think maybe that's why there's some constraints on who can see them. As far as we could tell, and we did a little bit of research on this, is this particular album was from someone who came over from the mainland as a school teacher. They were teaching first on Maui and then later on Oahu. So what you're seeing here are pictures from 1910 on Maui. we can't get a, I've not been able to find Kilapaki Village. My assumption is it's somewhere near Sprecklesville and the sort of Kahului side of Maui, but I'm not sure because a lot of the other pictures are Lahaina side, so it might be one of the two villages that was near what's now Kaanapali. I don't know, and I don't, at some point it really doesn't make a lot of difference. The main thing here is the fact that we've got a fascinating example of imagery from 1910 of what life was like on Maui. We do know that at least according to the images, that Kilapaki was tied to the plantation or one of the plantations. And oftentimes, if you look at the literature, you'll find that the plantations were, sort of criticized for the quality of the construction, but the construction was supposed to be these sort of wood barracks things and such like that. Waipahu Cultural Center, whatever it's called, has some later period one of these. But if you look at this lady's images from 1910, you see a whole different set of views of what the situation actually looked like. And this is what the village looked like from her, from pictures she took. This is still very much, this isn't a traditional Hawaiian house. It's a semi-traditional form of construction, but it's actually sort of a Western style house done with Hawaiian style materials. This type of matting that you see here on this side is actually a very typical weave. One of the ladies that I signed you years ago at the Kauai Museum thought that was actually a very typical weave for Kauai. So I don't know. I think different families in different, as in most areas, different families in different places would have different types of weaving of hala or niu. So I'm not sure if this is regional specific or not. But if you look at this, it gives you a very, very different view of what still existed in 1910 in Maui in terms of a poor working class settlement. Now, let me segue back to these. And this is where kids would play, but in some cases, it's also drinking water. This is definitely Wailuku side. It looks like Yale Valley there. Okay, this is both cute, but on the other hand, it's really sort of striking. This is what you would see at a public school in Hawaii up until the 1950s. Public schools were plantation schools. Public schools were in many cases actually originally funded, or at least the structure was built by the plantation. The students were the children of the plantation workers. If your family originally in part came over here during the plantation period, then somewhere along the line, one of these folks or their surrogates was your family member. And there's a whole mess of stuff that's important here. And sort of pay a fair amount of attention. This was a very special day because everyone's dressed. Notice how pretty much everyone has bare feet. That was typical on the plantations. Families couldn't afford shoes for kids. Most of these kids would have had two outfits. This is their Sunday outfit. So the boys have white or almost white or as close as they can get to white shirts. The girls have these. Everyone wears the hat. This was the hat. You still see this a little bit on the outer islands. If I go to the ranches over on the Big Island or Maui, a lot of the women, if they're out riding, will still have the hat. The hat was a real important part of male and female identity, especially for plantation workers, but for the general population. Everyone wore hats in Hawaii right into the 1930s. And so hats were actually a huge sort of statement of social significance. How you wore the hat. Notice how the ladies have the hat cocked on their head in rather interesting ways. That was one of the ways that you communicated style and sophistication. This was the original function of a hakule. Was especially these, and if my family still does these, where you do the real fancy feather lay for the headband, which my uncle sells for obscenely large sums of money. That's was part of this. So there was an actual very important style. If you notice, the women are all in dark skirts and white blouses, pretty much. That again was part and parcel of this. So there's a very, very structured, very consistent world. And if you know what's really interesting about this, you notice you don't have any idea except for the kids all look, Asian sort of or whatever, is that there's no way of sorting out who the kids were because the plantation wasn't interested in whether these kids are Japanese or Okinawan or Chinese or whatever. They're just part of the system. This goes to that assimilation thing I was mentioning last time. The plantations were the assimilation engine for the migrant workers that came here. And the schools were the assimilation engine for the kids. And in that process, that's what public education was. The goal of public education wasn't to educate in a sort of a sophisticated way that we think of it now. the function of the educational system was to assimilate these children to make them into good, territorial members of American society. And that was the job of these teachers. That was their function. Let's see if I can find this other. I'm going to have to skip back to this. Now, do you guys see this picture?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. That's weird that it's popping it up. I would have thought it canceled out. Okay. Here you see some of the Chinese that arrived. The folks here, the adults would have arrived here between 1778 and 1878 and 1885. They're still dressed in the type of outfits you see from Qing Dynasty China, which they probably almost invariably, in some cases, brought over with them, but in many cases have actually made here. They've dressed the kids up. I would guess this might be for Chinese New Year's. It might have been for the Autumn Festival, which is today. So for some sort of special occasion, some of the kids are dressed in traditional outfits. This boy here is in an actually sort of interesting outfit. This type of outfit is actually what you see in Guangdong province. All of these folks would have originally come from Zhongshan, which is a town in Guangdong province, because that's where almost all the Chinese that arrived here in the 19th century came from, within 5 miles of this pretty good sized town near Hong Kong. And so all these folks actually came from villages right near each other. In many cases, they didn't know each other, but they knew of the other village. So when they came to Hawaii, they were actually coming from, as we'll see, a particular part of China, in fact, a very small region of China. But also they're not Chinese, they're Cantonese. This particular outfit is very much what you see as a classic Cantonese outfit from the 19th century, especially the striped pants. These actually reflected different villages. So different villages would have different outfits that reflected that particular village. So if you were seeing kids walk around, notice how this kid has the same outfit. So note what that would mean is you could actually walk through a situation, say a New Year's festival in a larger town, and you could tell the villages people were from just by virtue of the outfits they were wearing. Very typical in South Chinese, in Cantonese society at the time. There's a little bit of this left with these kids. Now, of course, one of the huge differences we'll see is these ladies here only spoke Cantonese. They didn't speak any Mandarin, they only spoke Cantonese. The kids are already learning to be bilingual because the school's going to be taught in English. And the teachers don't know any Cantonese. That's in fact, that's probably the teachers back here. So these kids are going to have to learn English through what you call a classic immersion process, which means in some cases, by the time they get a little older, they're going to have a hard time talking to their parents. Which is a typical thing. Well, let's see here. Okay. Here you see the dichotomy of the plantation. Here you see the missionary boy group. If this is Maui, this is probably members of the Alexander Baldwin family, would be my guess, especially these two guys. So this is the folks that run the plantations. They own the plantations. They're the ones that are building the schools. They're the ones that are hiring these people. This is some of the Japanese workforce that have been imported to work on the plantation. Now, most of the women were usually, they came over either there's picture brides or else they came over already married. They ended up working both on the plantation, but a lot of them also ended up working in houses as servants, as maids, as nannies, or something like that. But right now they're dressed again in their holiday best, probably again for New Year's, I would guess. So what you see here is the dichotomy between this group and the group in charge. And notice how there's sort of an unintentional, and you have to remember a lot of this isn't really intentional. These guys aren't taking this picture to make a statement, but the reality is if you look at this image, is the statement is of a sophisticated group that's obviously in charge by virtue of their dress and their authority, and the women who are definitely in a second tier below them, which is, it's how this was all played out. I'm trying to find this one. Oh, here we go. Okay, this is the elites. This is the Kama'aina. This is the Kama'aina world. So if you visualize the Kalapaki village, and that's sort of that's the low end of the working world in Hawaii in the early 20th century. This is the high end of the world in the 20th century. This is the Castles, the Cooks, the Wilcoxes, the Alexanders, Baldwins. I mean, depending on what island, the Parkers over in the Big Island. This is their world. This is the world that they lived in. It's an emulation of the world in New England or the mainland United States, maybe a little bit San Francisco. Their outfits are what you had to wear. So this is the world, to a certain extent, this is 20 years earlier, but this would be if you ever had to read Great Gatsby in grade school or something like that. That would be, it's sort of close to that world. It's the same type of very elitist world. So you've got these two worlds coexisting. but they don't really have a lot in common. They're just sort of coexisting. And if you think of these two girls here, they undoubtedly go to a private school. If they're on Maui, which I'm pretty sure these are, they're going to Seabury's, which is still the elite private school on Maui, just like Hawaii Prep is for the Big Island. So that was their version of Punahou, if you want to think about it, on the case of Maui. So those girls are going to have basically no contact with those kids that we saw earlier that are going to public school. The only contact they might have is with maybe a couple of the adults who might be their nanny or might be someone who does, washing or the maid or something like that. But other than that, other than the role of servants, they're living in an entirely different world that almost coexists. So it's almost like oil and water. They're in the same physical location. This is a group that owns the property and owns the business the other group's working on. But the groups aren't interacting. And you can see this just in the dress. The dress of the women here is entirely different than the dress of the school teachers, who, though they might, and this goes back to what I was mentioning earlier, you have to remember the school teachers would be part of that professional group of haulis. The school teachers would not be acceptable to marry him, for example, because the school teachers are lower middle class, they're educators. He's supposed to marry someone who's elite. If he's from here, and I would guess he is, he looks a little bit like the dad here, then it's a good bet if that's his wife, and I suspect it is from the picture, she probably comes from New England. She might be one of the other families here in Hawaii, but traditionally the families here would marry from New England and bring their brides over. So they're going to marry in an entirely different network. So you've got these coexisting social networks, the local network of the plantation workers, sort of an intermediate layer of the places like the school teachers and other folks like that, that are not accepted in this tier of local society, but really are sort of above and don't really fit very well in the lower tier because they're above the plantation workers, obviously. So Hawaii was a very fixed, it was almost a caste system in the late 19th, early 20th century. And the group that were on the top of the feeding chain were folks like this. Let's see if I can find the, oh, here we go. Here's what's left of the Hawaiian system. And what's interesting to notice is one, this is a Hawaiian luau. It might be a church luau that looks like one of the churches, I'm not sure where. And this is how a luau was done traditionally. So a lot of this luau looks like it would have a couple of hundred years earlier, with the exception of the place. It would have been, woven fronds or something like that. But the way it's laid out, even the way that the people are positioned, is probably pretty close to what it had been for a really long time. Now, this is a Hawaiian luau. So in some level, even though you could argue that by 1910, Hawaiians were becoming more and more ethnic, and Hawaiian culture certainly wasn't the dominant anymore. What you still find is there's aspects of Hawaiian culture and Hawaiian values that permeate. And if you think about this versus that lunch I showed you just a couple of slides earlier of the Kama'aina having their lunch at tables and sitting down and stuff, you notice the totally distinctive difference between that lunch and this lunch. This is very much the idea of the collective. All the food is laid out in a long thing around here, and people would sit down at particular locations and the food would be shared. As we'll see, this becomes hugely important because even though they don't do it the same way, Chinese, for example, have a very similar attitude that when you eat, you do it as a collective enterprise. And if you've ever eaten Chinese food with Chinese folks, everything's in big plates and you'll pick from the plate. So if you would have said, in some ways, it's actually much closer to a luau than to a Western style dinner where everyone gets a plate with their food on it. And in fact, in sophisticated Anglo-American society, you never share food. You never give someone a taste of your food. It's considered really, really tacky. So what these folks are doing would be considered very, I don't know what you want to call it, by the folks that are having that Kama'aina lunch. Now you have to remember one of the odd aspects of that. If we go back to that Kama'aina lunch, if you visualize it, some of the folks sitting down at that lunch with the Kama'aina, of course, are also part Hawaiian. And when they were little kids, they would have sat at luau's like this. So you still get what you find even in the 20th century is the Kama'aina find themselves in an odd situation. For example, at a first-year birthday, a lot of the elites, especially the Wilcoxes and the Castles, were famous for this, of actually having luau's for the child who's just made it to 1 year of age. So they occasionally would still do something that reflected the Hawaiian side of their family history. Though the rest of the time they were real sort of, engraved in this whole sort of New England, Anglo-American, upper middle class look. And this is an entirely different population. You see the women on the holoku, for example. Again, notice the hat. local, especially Hawaiian style hat, which is still, you still see it on the other end, sort of. But Hawaiians and hats was a really big thing in the 19th and 20th century. And women especially would have a whole collection of hats and ways they would display. The hat was actually in some ways maybe more important than the outfits they're wearing. So what you see is a luau. I think I've got another picture here. Yeah, here we go. And here's everyone sitting down to the luau. Now, if you notice what's really interesting in this picture is here you've got the folks that work at the school at the luau, because of course these folks, it's their kids that are at the school. They're not at that fancy lunch where the combine is. They're here. Now, these women are almost invariably going to be from the mainland. In fact, about 99% of them are from the mainland. The guys probably from the mainland too. And they're over here teaching on contract for maybe, 3, 5, 7 years or something like that. This lady's albums only cover 2 years, so it's very possible she left and went back to the mainland after the end of that. So they were here temporarily, which is still true of a lot of the DOE teachers even today. So what you find is they're over here temporarily, and they're having to make a huge amount of cultural adjustment. The folks sitting down at this table are not going to be speaking English. The majority of these folks at this luau, as far as I can tell, and I can't really blow this up anymore, look Hawaiian, so they're still speaking Hawaiian. This would be Maui dialect Hawaiian, probably from, I'm going to guess since the other picture for Lahaina, maybe Lahaina side. And if you notice, here's your poi bowls, right in the middle. These folks have, looks like, food laid out on plates. So they have individual plates, which again is them trying to adjust to a luau, but with some idea if you have individual food and you don't share it. So what you see is sort of an interesting situation of these folks being betwixt and between. And this is the important thing to remember about the haole as a population here. For the Hawaiians here, the teachers here were seen radically different than the Kama'aina that ran the plantations. If you ask them, they'd say, yeah, they're all haole. But they would see these ladies and this guy here being radically different by virtue of the relationship they had with them. These folks were actually trying to teach their kids. And they actually came to the luau. And they tried to sort of figure out what was going on. They probably never learned much Hawaiian. And of course, some of the kids, a lot of the kids in the school they'll know some Hawaiian, but their basic language is going to be Japanese, Okinawan, Chinese, or I should say Cantonese or whatever. So this is a very mixed bag. Some of the folks sitting down at this table, or I should say down at the luau, are probably Chinese or Japanese adults. So what you see is what you see here is the first stage of the development of local society. And the group that it doesn't include is the Kama'aina, because they're making a huge attempt to distance themselves from this world. So it's a fascinating album, just because it wasn't done intentionally. It wasn't like someone's trying to make a social statement. Here you see the actual plantation, and here's part of the workforce with probably the plantation office. Okay, it actually says. So that's where all those people worked. And that means that Kalapaki village probably must be Wailuka's side, so it must be in Spreckelsville. And here's the school. This is the school for working children. So this kid's got to be Portuguese, I can almost guarantee, or else he's one of the teacher's kids possibly. And here you have your classic mixed population already in the school. If you think about this you could change the outfits. You could actually, if you did a Photoshop, you could stick these faces on a bunch of kids down at Jared Intermediate or one of the elementary school here, and they'd vanish in there. You'd never notice the difference. So you've already got a developing complex mix of kids with mixed, and in some cases single ethnic, but certainly mixed backgrounds, and certainly in a mixed social setting. While they're all having to learn how to deal and interact with each other. They're not necessarily happy about it, but they've figured out how to do it. And that's the key aspect of the development of local society here, is these kids and then the world that they exist in. Okay, so all this sort of ties in this. I just wanted to give you the visuals before I just go into some of the details. I already mentioned the plantation system. Its main function, of course, was to make money. It was a business. And those guys that we saw having lunch saw themselves as business owners. They were running a very labor-intensive business. And they had to import labor from Asia because they couldn't find cheap labor anywhere else. You know, in that context, it's important to remember that the plantation, to the guys that are having that continental lunch, they in a rather, well, you know, it's not to diss on them. You have to remember, I think this is still very true if you actually talk to most folks who are involved in production. People are machines. People are one human power machine, and I think in the same way that the idea of a horsepower, you know, a 10 horsepower moped or something like that, that's 10 horses. So, you know, we use the term in a technical sense, but you have to remember that until basically World War II, in the vast majority of production, a lot of production was involved on people actually doing stuff. And so this was the idea of the assembly line, was people actually putting things together, or in the plantation, these are the folks cutting the cane, moving stuff around, processing the cane. There's parts of it which are based on engineering and modern production, but a lot of it's just people. So the folks running the plantation, one of their main resources is the human-powered machines they have. And that's how they saw the world. So that picture, one of the first pictures I showed you, the guys and the Japanese women dressed in the front, they would have seen, on one hand, they understand they're ladies and they're Japanese and they're real human beings and stuff like that. On the other hand, if one of them decided she didn't want to do enough work, they would fire her in a second because she's there to get work done. Especially because you have to remember the folks in charge are all Congregationalists. They're imbued with this idea of heavy work, that working hard is God's will, God's intent. So it's not a group which is going to take the idea of people not wanting to work as something they should consider. They just see the world as consisting of human-powered machines. Some are more successful, more clever, and that's what they'd see themselves as the Kama'aina. Some groups have a potential and haven't realized it yet, which would be the plantation workers. And another group has potential and hasn't shown up yet, and that would be the kids in the schools. But they see everyone within this idea of basically labor units, you know, or work units. Let's see, I already mentioned the Calvinist morality part and the missing workforce. In fact, if you think about that, school is a perfect example of this Calvinist getting in the way of profit. If you're going to be pure profit, then building that school those kids were at, that public school. And then in many cases, the plantation's paying for the teachers. I think how it worked is the territory paid part of the salary of the teachers and the plantation paid part of the salary of the teachers. So from a purely mercenary standpoint, the plantation is losing money that it could have because it's paying for a school, it's paying for the upkeep of the school, it's paying part of the salary of the teachers. And that's money that could go to shareholders or the owners or something like that if they didn't have that expense. In that way, as I mentioned last time, that's one of the ways that the Calvinist, Puritan, Congregationalists here were radically different than the plantation economies anywhere else in the world. If you go to someplace like Jamaica, which has plantations from the 1600s on, the plantation owners in London or in Paris or something like that, they never spend a penny on the population of Jamaica. They never put in schools. They never put in recreational facilities. They could give a rat's ass what the plantation labor force in Jamaica did. Just as long as they showed up and right till the 1950s when the plantations sort of shifted ownership in Jamaica, right down till then they saw them in a very brutal way as human-powered machines. And you have to remember that's the concept of slavery. Slavery is basically a human-powered version of going down to Lowe's and buying a leaf blower. You go down to Lowe's and you buy something with a motor and you paid the money more and it should work and it does what it's supposed to do. That's what slavery was. Slavery was you see people as nothing more than machines. And therefore you use them. If they don't work, you throw them away. And to be honest, that's what the Caribbean was right into the late mid-20th century. Slavery might have ended a lot earlier, but in many ways economically, the semi-indentured servitude they had in Jamaica to the 1950s was really very much sort of the same thing. It's more variable in term. Noah's asking, are plantations a purely Western idea? Yes and no. That's a totally lousy answer. Growing things for profit has been a part of economies for thousands of years. The Chinese have grown all sorts of stuff for the last 8,000 or 9,000 years. And people in charge basically told other people, you guys are going to do this. But on the other hand, yes, it is Western when what happens when you get into this idea of agribusiness. An example, your spice farms in Indochina and Indonesia would be a good example. The spice farms that existed in, say, the Arab period, say from 500 to 900 AD in like Indonesia, in the Halmaheras, those were you used the spices that you grew to trade for food. But it was still largely, there was sort of a subsistence aspect to that. When the Portuguese and then the Dutch come in, and well, even the Arabs come in, but certainly the Dutch and the Portuguese come in, then what you have is an abstracted, distant plantation owner who might be living in Rotterdam or in Lisbon or something like that, who then orders the folks in the plantation to grow the spices, and that's converted to money, and then a little bit of that money goes back to pay the workforce. So when you end up as part of a global economy, that's when the plantations become the Western version. The Western version of the plantation is like the other ones, but it's a lot more brutal. And probably what's most importantly, at least in here in the Pacific, is it's just becomes the only way to do business in much of the Pacific. There's still a lot of the Pacific. If you go to Fiji, if you go to Samoa, places like that, you'll find acres and acres in coconut palms. That was all planted in the mid-late 19th century for the purpose of converting coconut oil, or like coconut nut, into coconut oil, which was then sold in the global market. So all of those plantations, with almost no exceptions, were owned by either Brits or foreigners from somewhere else. And that's the Western idea. In the traditional system, what would happen is it would usually go to a local elite. So the old spice plantations in East Bali, for example, those went to the I can't remember what they called the guys. It wasn't Shah, whatever the term was for the guy in charge of the area. That actually was given as tax to him. But those folks were also growing food on other pieces of parcels for them to eat. So it was a much more complex, sophisticated process. The Western system is just stripped down to its minimum. You guys are growing this, you guys are machinery, and I need the products because I'm going to sell those. And by the way, if you're really lucky, I'll pay you a little bit. And of course, in slavery, you had a weird context, and slavery was found throughout a lot of the Pacific. You didn't find it here, technically. But for example, in the Western Pacific, a lot of the Australian economy was built off of slaving folks from Melanesia and what they call blackbirding right into the 1870s. In fact, slavery was legal. Blackbirding was legal in Queensland and New South Wales till something like 1905, where the British Empire had quit slavery in like 1830 or something like that. So slavery persists here in the Pacific a lot later than it does a lot of other places. And the key thing about that is that you've paid money for the person that you've now acquired, that you bought. And then what you do is you have to be fairly careful because, of course, just like a moped, if you guys buy a moped, you want to make sure you put oil and gas in the right amounts, because if it breaks, then you're out the money of the moped. And the same way that slavery was an economic engine, you had to make sure at some point in a cynical way you took care of your slaves, otherwise you'd lost the investment in them. But you weren't interested in how they saw the world. They were then in the way that any of you sit there and pet your moped and talk to it and ask it how it feels to do. Maybe you guys do, I don't know. So it's that same type of thing. So that's the Western plantation is entirely mercenary. It's entirely capitalist, and it's based on a global system. In the sense, it's a global economy. And what that means, among other things, and we certainly see it here, is that if you're the plantation, you're growing sugar, you're only going to grow sugar as long as you can make money off of sugar. If you can't make money off of sugar anymore, then you're going to quit. You're not going to, and that for all the people that are working on a plantation, you're going to fire them. Because, sorry, folks, we're out of business. And you guys can see this in 2020 with the large companies going under. Sears and all those guys like that. Oh, I'm sorry, we just made a bad series of decisions and you guys are all fired. And if you're really unlucky, we'll also get rid of your pension plans. So none of this has changed. It's a very brutal Western view where there's no social relationship. It's very much what we call negative reciprocity in anthropology. Is the labor system that you see that the Europeans make global in the 17th and 18th and 19th century that becomes the norm. And of course, is what you guys grew up with. It's the only one that we've got here pretty much. So sorry for the long answer, but yeah, it ties into this anyways. Now, as I mentioned, you can see that in those images. One of the key things here is the fact that, of course, that the Kama'aina elite see the entire population. They're not interested in where the population's from, except maybe the guys from China cost them a little bit more to pay for in terms of their salary than the folks from Japan or something like that. But other than that, they're not interested in where the folks are from. In their view, if you're hired to work on the plantation, it's a sugar plantation, your job is to cut cane, your job is to do this, your job is to do that. And so that's, you know, that's where it's at. They're totally disinterested in the fact that the Japanese can't stand the Okinawans, for example. The Japanese and Koreans, you better not put them in the same room because they very well might go after each other. And the plantation owner's just going to say, dude, you know, I'm not paying you to have, you know, you have issues, you go do that on your own time. But you guys are being hired to do X, and I expect you to do X. And if you do anything else, then I'm gonna have the guys beat you up, and we'll throw you in solitary confinement in an iron box for a day or two until you get your act together and grow up and be an adult. So the plantations had no interest in the life history or the cultures that the working force came from. And much as people hated that, you have to remember that people very rarely assimilate by choice. You can certainly see that here, even in the 21st century. If one of you, for example, decides to do the JET program, which hopefully they'll start up again next year, which is fantastic, we go teach English in Japan for a year. And I strongly recommend when you graduate, you do that if you haven't, think of it, or a similar one in Korea. Then you're doing it by choice. So, and Angelica decides that she's going to go teach English in Japan for a year. At some point, she's accepted the fact that she's going to have to assimilate in part to being in a Japanese school with Japanese students in a part of Japan. So there's a set of, you know, precepts that she's sort of bought into that she's going to have to do. On the other hand, if she finds herself, you know, hanging around here, and all of a sudden, I don't know what she'd find herself doing, but all of a sudden the workplace she's in ends up suddenly being 90% Japanese, and now she's got to change, but it's not something she really had intentional. She doesn't have any choice in the matter. She's got to assimilate, but no one ever asked her if she wanted to. That's actually much more typical of what most folks go through. And this is certainly one of the big issues on the US mainland. As I think I was mentioning this before, one thing that you can sort of say about Hawai'i Anglo culture in the mainland United States is it's never had to assimilate. They never had to go through that process of adapting to be someone else. And this is why mainland Americans frequently, especially Anglo-Americans, are absolutely clueless about how people anywhere else on the planet operate. It's just not of interest to them because it's not relevant. They've never had to deal with it. So they've never had to actually adjust to people that have a different set of values and attitudes. In a situation they have to adjust, versus they might out of curiosity or take an anthropology class or something like that. And so what happens is the plantations force a workforce who is not interested in becoming bicultural or multicultural. They force them to become multicultural. And this is the way you assimilate. You don't assimilate by choice. You assimilate because you have to. In the same way that the easiest way to learn a foreign language is to suddenly find yourself stuck in northern Hokkaido and you're the only Haole or the only folks from Hawaii are you in the town of 7,000 people. In fact, she had one of your fellow students years ago. She actually taught in the JET program. She was the only, well, she was actually from the mainland, so she was actually Haole, but she was, you know, she'd grown up in part here. And she suddenly found herself as the only non-Japanese in a 7,000 or 8,000 person town. So, you know, she had to assimilate, and she did really well. She loved it. In fact, I think she now lives there. She stayed 20 years later. She's still there. But that's the sort of, you know, dump them in the deep end type approach. Now, the other thing that you have to remember, and this was part of the geopolitics of the 19th century, is the plantations start up here very, very late. The plantation system starts up in the 1830s, 1840s. By then, the plantation system in Louisiana, Florida, and places like that has been around since the mid-1700s. The plantation system in the Caribbean has been around since the late 1500s, early 1600s. That's also true of Latin America. The plantation system in a lot of Asia, like Noah pointed out, in some way, shape, or form, has been around for maybe 3,000 years. But the modern plantation system starts up with the Portuguese and the Spanish again in the early mid-1500s. So the rest of the world had been in plantations for hundreds of years in many cases. Hawaii is one of the last areas in the world that gets into the plantation system, and especially with things like sugar. And so in that situation, they have sort of several problems. One is because Hawaii is an independent country till 1898. It means that Hawaii can't recruit from the big labor pools that other places had. And this is where we look so different than Fiji. Fiji gets into sugar at exactly the same time, within about 5 years as Hawaii. But Fiji by then is a British colony, which is, when you think about it, is what Hawaii might have been if the British hadn't given it back to Kamehameha III. So if you want to see, you know, the alternate options, Fiji is a real interesting sort of parallel comparison to Hawaii. So Fiji's a British colony. And like their Hawaiian counterparts, Fijians weren't interested in working in the plantation system. It just didn't interest them. They didn't see the value of it. They didn't buy into this whole sort of thing. Now, remember, your British plantation owners aren't Calvinist. They're just Anglican Church, typical Protestant Brits. So in a weird way, they have a much more disinterested relationship with their workforce. They don't have the Calvinist morality thing going. They just want to make money. So they have to, like their plantation owners here, they have to bring in a workforce. They have to import labor. Now, because they're part of the British Empire, they can only recruit labor from within the British Empire. So what happens is the plantation owners in Fiji recruit from the southeast part of India called Madras, and they bring in tens of thousands of Madrasi workers from South India to work on the plantations in Fiji. And a large part of that population still exists in Fiji. One of our adjuncts till recently, Usha, was actually the descendant of one of those. Her grandparents went over to Fiji. She was Indo-Fijian. And so you end up by the 1960s in Fiji, your single largest population group in Fiji is not indigenous Fijians, but it's Indo-Fijians whose grandparents or whoever were brought over as plantation workers in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, just like the plantation workers here. But because it's the British Empire, you have to recruit from the empire. Now, Hawaii's case was the opposite. Because Hawaii was not part of any empire, because Hawaii was independent, the Hawaiian plantation owners could not recruit from the British Empire. They could not recruit from the French Empire or the Portuguese or the Dutch or the other empires. Now, what that meant is that a huge part of the world's population that was already under colonial rule, they didn't have access to. So they had to find parts of the planet where there were people who didn't belong to some foreign power and recruit from there. And what happened is the plantation owners here were on one hand so mercenary in the sense that they paid so little and they treated people so poorly. And on the other hand, they had these political limitations that they couldn't find one place and persistently recruit. The British guys in Fiji could. They could just keep recruiting from India because they're all part of the system and everyone's going to put up with it. As we'll see, the plantation owners here initially recruit from China, from Zhongshan and Guangdong province, those the photos we saw. But very quickly, within 5 years, the way they treat the Chinese workforce, how little they pay them, and the stunts they put them up to, that workforce protests the Chinese government, which of course is still an independent country, tells the plantations, you guys are abusing this, so you can't recruit from China anymore. So at that point, the plantations, which still need workers, have to go shopping somewhere else. And the next place they find is Japan. So the reason you have such a kapakahi mix of people here is because the plantations persistently every 3, 4, or 5 years would have to recruit from another part, largely in Asia, to also, as we'll see, the Portuguese. And then they did such a bad job of taking care of those folks that country would basically say, hey, you guys are terrible. You can't recruit any more of our people because you're just abusing them. And they'd have to go find someone else. So this is why you end up with the Chinese, followed by the Japanese, followed by the Koreans and Okinawans, followed by the, it just goes on and on. And but you don't see the link to a particular empire population base. So this is why Hawaii is so much more diverse than you find anywhere else in the Pacific. If you're in Australia, you had to recruit from areas that were under British control. If you were in New Caledonia, or in Tahiti, you had to recruit from areas under French control, which is why if you go to Tahiti, you find one of the larger groups are Vietnamese. Why? Because French Indochina was part of the French Empire. And if you wanted workers and you couldn't find Tahitians to do it, you bring in folks from Southeast Asia. Here in Hawaii, you don't have that. So here in Hawaii, it's a very diverse population, which is what we saw in that one picture of the kids in the schoolroom. A very, very mixed population that reflects the political realities of being an independent country in the 19th century. Because you have to remember, pretty much, with the exception of the Filipinos, the rest of the workforce is already here before we become part of the United States in 1899. So that's this inability to recruit from the colonial empire. Now, I don't know if I have this detailed here. No, I don't. Okay. Last thing I'm gonna have to do, this is easier to do on a board, but I don't feel like pulling out my whole sheet. The plantations were odd. The plantations on one hand were the basic thing you have to understand the plantations work logic here. You have to go back to this one here. On one hand, they were going to maximize their profits. The Kaumai wanted to make lots of money. They wanted to send their kids to private schools here in Hawaii and then send their kids to good schools in New England. They wanted their kids to have big weddings, to live in beautiful houses, and to have a lot of status and prestige, and maybe hang around with the Kennedys or the Rockefellers or whoever's the big power brokers in New England society at the time. And to do that, you needed cash. And so they were constantly short of money. They constantly needed more money. So they classically aggressive when it came to making money. On the other hand, there's this morality component. And this sort of got on their ways in really weird ways, but they also found sort of weird ways around it, which is sort of also reflects the Mahele thing we talked about earlier. The plantation, they thought they were very clever. And it's sort of amazing how people can do stupid stuff and they think it's clever. And they can do it again and again. They still think it's clever. And outside you're sort of like, dude, you know, don't you realize like the third time around this is pretty dumb? The dumbest thing they did probably, or one of the dumbest things, is they intentionally take a lot of different advantages of the workforce that were above and beyond how little they were paying them. And the way that they did this, and this is why they thought they were being so clever and making a little extra money, is if you worked on the plantation, you basically were in a situation, let me go back to this, I'm going to talk about this again, the picture. Wait. If you worked on the plantation, so here's the plant. Here's like one of the camp houses. This is probably one of that might be the store there. So this is one of the plantations. If you worked on the plantations, you're living in a barracks. You're getting paid an incredibly small amount of money, even by plantation wages elsewhere in the world. And you know, the only advantage you get is you get free public education and free this and free that. But you know, if you're a single adult male, then you're not getting much anything out of it. The plantations thought they were being very clever. What they did is they set it up so if you're one of the guys working here, you didn't get paid in cash. You got paid in basically a version of what you guys would call a gift card. And that gift card, they used to call them chits. The gift card would actually only be, you could only spend it, we'll say this is the company store. Each of the plantations or each cluster of plantations would have a little store. You could only spend your gift card at the store. And they say, well, that'd be true. If you have a Whole Foods gift card or a Target gift card, you only spend it at Target. It's probably a version of that. So what you did is at the end of the month, you got your, your chit, you got the amount of money that you've made. From that would be deducted anything they could think of, short of consuming oxygen. And then of course they're not feeding you. You have to pay for your own food. Now, because the only place you can use that gift card is, we'll say, at this place, and they know that's the only place you can use the gift card, what they're going to do is they're going to charge you whole food prices for the rice and the other stuff that you need to survive on. I'm sorry if you shop at Whole Foods, because they know they got a captive market. You can't convert that to cash. Now you can. For a fee, you can go to the store and they will convert it to cash for you, but they usually take like a 20% cut off the top. So they make it so that you have to buy everything from the store, from the plantation store. This was the old Waipahu store that's now gone. One of the last ones that was left was the Kaloa store. When I first moved here, the Kaloa store was still the plantation was gone, but it still was a company store sort of. And when you went in there, if you lived in Kaloa like I did, you actually just you set up an account and you'd go into the store and they actually had your name on a book. The little old lady would actually write your name down there and she'd figure out how much you bought. You didn't pay cash. You actually went and put the stuff there. She added it all up and put it. And at the end of the month, she sent you a bill for what you owed for the month and you paid it. It was basically it had to be one of the last plantation stores in the Hawaiian Islands. And it worked that way till, I don't know, it was still there when I left in Kauai in '78. And I think it ended a couple of years later. Now it's a store. But that was the plantation store. So they had the workforce in a situation that the workers were having to pay an obscenely large amount of money for their basic needs. Now the plantation loved that because the plantation owned the store. So they thought this was a little nasty extra way to get a little bit of money out of their workforce. They pay them crappy wages, and they basically steal a chunk of that back for anything they want to buy in the store, and they can only buy stuff in the store. If they want to send money back home to China or something like that, they can do that as a money order, but again, it's going to cost them. So probably even walking to the front door of the store cost you money. And the plantations thought they were so smart in doing this. Now you have to remember that the workforces that come here, and I don't care whether they're Filipino, Japanese, Chinese, the whole enchilada, every single group that comes over here, the only reason they're living in these shitty situations is to make money and send it home. They're not coming to Hawaii because it's Sandalwood Mountain. They're not coming to Hawaii because they thought the streets were paved in gold. All the romantic crap that you hear in 100th year anniversaries here, like stuff like that, that's nonsense. The reality is they came over here because the situation at home was terrible. The only way out for the family to stay away from starvation or death was to send family members overseas to export labor. And then their job, their obligation to the family was to send money back home to help the family survive. So the Chinese families and the Japanese families that we saw in those earlier pictures, the only reason they were in Hawaii was to send money back to their family back in the home country so they can survive. So the minute the plantation screws them out of every penny they earn, so they don't have any, if they're going to feed themselves, they don't have any money to send back home, then their entire reason for being here is gone. And this is, the plantations for some reason never figured this out. Their desire to get that last penny out of everyone basically destroyed the entire system, because what happened is sooner or later the guys sitting around here, these folks aren't stupid. And it was so bad that if you get one of the guys working here, by the time he's worked at the plantation for 4 years, he actually owes the plantation money. So not only are they not paying him very much, but because of the cost of things like rice and such like that, which they intentionally overinflate, he's actually at the point where every month he's working at a loss. And so then if he tries to quit or something like that, they're going to say, no, you still owe us like, $150 because you owe us, what you haven't paid in your back cost and wages and stuff like that. So you can't. If he tries to leave, they'll actually put him in chains, put him in solitary confinement for a couple of days or in jail, and then throw him back out in the workforce and say, you do this or else we're going to whip you, which they did. So on one hand, it wasn't slavery, but it wasn't, it was certainly indentured servitude. And so what happens is, not surprising, these guys who aren't dumb basically realize that the only way that they're going to get ahead is if they get out of the situation. So persistently, one group after the other starts up in here. They get on the plantation. They figure out how the system here in Hawaii works. They figure they're getting screwed. They learn enough of which is now called pidgin. So they learn enough that they can communicate with people who aren't the same as them. They come to the realization, oftentimes very shocked, that it's a much different world out there, especially with the Hawaiians outside of the plantation system. And then they get their ass out of here. They leave. The vast majority of the workforce in Hawaii breaks their contract with the plantation. Now, normally what would happen is the plantation would be all outraged, and they would do this. They'd go around, they'd send their police out, and they'd go and arrest people and bring them back. And one of the weird aspects, if any of you are in CJ, is the fact that the police forces in the Hawaiian Islands under the monarchy were actually plantation. They weren't government police. They were plantation police, which meant if you're a worker and if you're Chinese and they decide that you're one of the guys off of their plantation, you might not be, but if you can't prove it, they're just going to beat your ass in Hawaii. All of a sudden, you're going to find yourself working for their plantation. There were sheriffs that were the only government employees in the Hawaiian Islands, but the police in the different islands were plantation police. So if you were an Aiea, that was the Aiea plantation police. If you moved over to Pearl City, that was another plantation. They had their own police force. And some of them were just stunningly brutal because there was no system of controls. You think it's bad now. It was just mind-blowingly bad back in the 19th century. So on one hand, you had this very brutal, oppressive system of control. On the other hand, the plantations being very cynical, and of course, again, the profit motive. What they found was, and the Chinese are your best example because they're the first group over. They're the first group that ditched the plantations. They're the first group to figure out alternatives. So if you're one of the if you're a couple of these guys working here and you're Chinese, it's 1879. You've been here for 2 years. You've been absolutely reamed by the plantation. You can't send money home. For all you know, the family starved to death back in Guangdong. So in desperation, you jump ship. You get the hell off of the plantation. By the time you've been there a couple of years, you have some idea of the lay of the land. And you realize, for example, if you go to upcountry Maui, if you go to Kula, if you go up country there, that there's a bunch of Hawaiians up there and there's no plantations. So you go up there and you've scoped it out. Maybe on your day off, you used to walk up there and pretend you were just sort of cruising around. And what you notice, there's a bunch of plantation land up there in the sun, I should say, agricultural land up there that's fallow. Because as the Hawaiian population shrank or moved away, there was a lot of abandoned agricultural land, especially for things like sweet potatoes, that wasn't being used by the 1870s, 1880s. The plantations didn't want it because it was the wrong type of land for sugar. So it was just sitting there. And so what you've done is you found out what family, usually a Maka'inana family actually owns that land, and you actually approach them, and in the broken pigeon that you picked up in your time on the plantation, you go to this family, maybe around Pukalani somewhere or something like that, and you go and say, hey, Could I work this land for you? And so what you do is you do a deal. So you make a deal like maybe that they'll get 50% of what you make off of growing stuff on the land, and you'll get 50%. So say a 50-50 cut. So you start growing sweet potato or Chinese dalo or something like that on the land, or raising ducks or something like that. And what you do is when you sell those ducks for food, is that then half of that money goes to the landowners, the Maka'anana owners, and you keep half the money. Now, from your standpoint, there's two things that are your advantage. One is you're getting paid in cash, which means that you can choose how to spend the money. You don't have to go to the plantation store anymore. In fact, you better stay away from it because you just skipped contract. And secondly, is that means also that if you want to work harder, you're going to make more money, which means you've got more money to send home. So once you leave the plantation, you can actually achieve your original goal, which was to send money home. And of course, you have to remember that the vast majority of these folks were figuring after maybe 7 or 10 years, they were going to go back home too. The huge majority of the plantation workforce never intended to stay in Hawaii. They get trapped here because of economic realities, oftentimes global stuff, but they never intended to. So almost I can guarantee everyone that was living in this barracks, it never occurred to them that they'd be retiring in Hawaii and have kids raised in Hawaii. They would have been freaking out if you told them that. They would have said, no, man, my ass is out of here, forget it, no way. So you have to remember the plantation workforce saw this as temporary. The plantation owners saw them as temporary. They figured after 7 years, you send that guy back to China because he's all worn out, and you get a new kid from China who's new and strong and dumb, and you get him to do the same work, and by the time he's figured it out, you ship his butt out there and you get another one. So both sides agreed. This was supposed to be a temporary rotating workforce. Once you leave the plantation and you're making money, your attitude starts to change. And especially with the Chinese, since they're first off the boat, you might say, is for the Maka'anana that owned a lot of this, marginal property that the Chinese workforce, moves in on. They see the Chinese guy in two ways. One is he's now converting land that was making no money back into land that's making money. And he's a farmer. He's the same as they are. And this means that the Maka'anana family can now keep control of their land because there's someone working it. So now they can pay the taxes on it. Now they can put a fence and keep the adverse possession thing out of the way. So initially they see this guy as being a really fantastic situation that's helped them to save their land. The second thing that then occurs is that somewhere along the line, they start to realize that his values and attitudes, he's doing this because he's loyal to his family. He's very into the idea of shared or group. He identifies himself as part of a group. They start to realize, even though they don't share the same language and in some ways at all the same culture, a lot of their basic values are very, very, very similar. If you remember that Hawaiian chart I showed you, I think I posted a week or two ago, this in that one PowerPoint. Chinese fall almost entirely down on the Hawaiian side of that. It's a different idea of who the extended family or clan is, but it's the same general concept. And so from the Chinese guy's standpoint, he's now been in Hawaii maybe 8 or 10 years. The chance of going home is now getting a little more faded. It doesn't look like things are going to get any better in China, and God knows they didn't. So he's now sort of resigned to the fact that he might be here for a long time, if not forever. And he's starting to look at the family he's working the land of, the Maka'anana family, and he's thinking, I've got a daughter and she's sort of cute. She seems to sort of like me. Maybe I should see whether she wants to get married, and I'm just going to set up roots here. And this is what happened with the groups. The Chinese had the easiest access to this because they were the first. And for the Hawaiians, who were and still aren't a color-based society, in the Hawaiian system, as we noticed with their embracing of the Haulis that initially come over, in the Hawaiian attitude, if you buy into the concepts of the family, if you're loyal to the family, if you do stuff for the family, if you're going to be a good contributing member of the family, then you can be a family. They don't care what you look like, and they don't care where you're from. So for the Hawaiians who found themselves in rural areas, the Chinese were almost like a godsend, because this allowed them to basically start to re-expand families that were shrinking, with folks who are actually willing to marry into the family and be a part of the family. And if you go to Kula, you'll find the vast majority of the population up there is Chinese Hawaiian. Part of the family history is on the Hawaiian side, part of the family history is on the Chinese side. The land ownership is from the Hawaiian side, but the working of the land in the 19th century is from the Chinese side. And they saw themselves as Chinese Hawaiians. And growing up in the household, they probably wouldn't have been speaking more Hawaiian than Chinese, because the only one speaking Chinese would have been the husband. The wife and the family would have been a Hawaiian family. And so what you get is this is your first sort of Hapa population, is the Chinese Hawaiians in the work setting. The first true Hapa group, of course, would be the Congregationalist missionary traders and the Hawaiian chiefs, but that's, that's your Kawaii group. So that's what the Chinese do. And the plantations are an interesting situation. They should have stopped this. But the reality is, of course, the plantation store wants to make more money. And if the Chinese guy comes down from up country and he's got a bag of rice and bags of sweet potatoes and stuff, and he sells them to the store can pay him very little money, relatively speaking, for that, less than they would pay someone from the mainland to grow rice. So they get the rice cheaper, but then they sell it for a really high price to the new group of folks on the plantation. So the plantation was making enough money off of these escaped workers who were then selling stuff back to the plantation to be sold in the store, that it really dawns on them, it actually makes more sense to not chase this guy down and bringing his ass back to finish contract. It makes more sense to just pretend he's disappeared, buy stuff from him, and ream over the next group of workers. So this becomes the reality of the Hawaiian plantation system. Everyone stays here for a couple of years, gets their butt off of the plantation, moves into someplace else, and then somehow gets tied into the plantation as a support group, but no longer works for the plantation. And then you bring in a new workforce here, which would have been Japanese, and then later Okinawans, Koreans, etc. So that's sort of the weird plantation history that makes up Hawaii, which is unique and results in what we call the local population. It's just a very odd scenario that we have here. So, okay, does that all sort of make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. It's fairly straightforward. The only confusion is you find a lot of the groups, especially when they do their centennials, or Chinese pretty soon probably have their bicentennial, is that they oftentimes, this gets spun over into a very romantic, we all of us migrated over to Hawaii because our grandparents wanted to live in Hawaii and it was so beautiful, stuff like that. You go back in time and those people are thinking just like, what? It was a very brutal reality of the plantation system, and people just had to take advantage of what little they could given how little there was out there. So as long as you understand that, then why groups did what they did and made the choices they made makes a lot more sense. And it's also the ambivalent way that people looked at the plantation system. They realized they'd been reamed over by the plantation directly, but then indirectly, when they move off the plantation are oftentimes the main buyers of their products. So, it's a weird relationship the plantations had. And I'd argue in some ways the resort enclaves and hotels in the 21st century have become the new plantations in many ways, especially when we've seen this with COVID. There's somewhat of that relationship still there. Okay, if there's no questions, we'll call a halt.